Um, Thank you very much. On behalf of Asim Premji University, I would like to extend a kind of warm welcome to all of you in this afternoon to participate in the symposium on how social science and humanities and social science research is done in India and evaluated in India, how scholars in humanities and social sciences communicate with each other, and what are the internal social norms that influence scholarly communication in humanities and social sciences. This symposium is going to, we are going to discuss about these issues issues particularly, but I would like to give a kind of overview about the symposium series, which is about open access to scholarly information in humanities and social science research, particularly the research information in humanities and social sciences. For the past 20 years, there is a rise to the idea of open access to scholarly information in general by using web and related technologies cleverly. Because in the existing systems like journals, there was a gap in acceptance between the acceptance of the paper and the publishing of the paper. There was a huge gap. In the fields where the scientific ideas obsolete very faster, they wanted to have a kind of different mechanism to communicate with their peers to get their ideas validated. The archive physicists first started communicating their research, sharing their preprints even before sending a copy of a paper to a journal. They started uploading their paper in preprint servers, and such preprint server became a kind of main medium of communication among physicists. Now they don't largely depend on journals to claim priority of ideas in their field. Since then, there is a huge rise. Funding agencies, particularly the science funding agencies, showed huge interest to make the research that originate from the research that they fund to be openly available to all possible would-be users. They started, mandating, in the funding agencies in the UK, USA started mandating researchers to make their papers openly available to all possible would-be users. In the recent Science, Technology and Innovation Policy 2020, the draft has just come out, has given huge emphasis on open science, and they have proposed very interesting ideas. And this policy has understood the important problems in scholarly communications in India. One is access to information. The second one is visibility of the research produced from Indian research laboratories or research institutions. These two problems they want to solve, and they have designed the policy in such a way that if the policy is implemented properly, these problems which one can overcome. Scientific institutions are giving importance because they give facilities by setting up institutional repositories for them to make their papers openly accessible. So increasingly this is happening in science, technology, and medicine, engineering and medicine field. If you take the Indians, the STIP 2020, the recent policy, there are some important points because they are going to set up a very high power repository, and they are asking all the scientists to deposit the final refereed manuscripts in one copy of the manuscript should be deposited in that repository. And the repository will make the access problem solve. Anyone who have internet can have access to the final refereed draft, and they can download, use, build upon. And the second important problem, which is the second important point is the one nation and one subscription. The scientific funding agencies want to subscribe journals for all Indians. Anyone from all Indian citizens can have access to scholarly journals, which are very. They want to. They are negotiating with publishers to provide a kind of nationwide access to scholarly journals. See, that is very important. But one point which is missing in science, technology, innovation policy is that they don't want to include the issues in making open access to humanities and social science information. So this policy is strict about its boundaries. They talk about the journals published in science, technology, engineering, and medicine. But in these fields, journals are the main medium of communication that we also have to note. And government want to really make those journals accessible possible would be users. So in these circumstances, what we feel is open access to humanities and social science information is also key, and access to information is multidisciplinary information is key for social science research. But the social science research setup and community systems we feel are indifferent to these kind of developments. And social science research is not just published in one medium like journals. People use different kind of mediums and different document types. In some fields, the working papers are valued. In some field, you have to publish a book to claim priority of thoughts or ideas. In some fields, journal articles are accepted as an important contribution of a scientist. But here in social sciences also, everywhere, every application for funding, call for funding, ask for publication details. But there is a pecking order. If you publish a paper in high impact factor journals, the visibility of the paper is very high. But in social and in citations form a kind of fabric in science. That they are valued not just for how count the number of times it is cited, but the references create a kind of fabric, discovery tool in science. But the citations are not used as much as it is used in science, technology, medicine fields. So precisely these are the issues: copyright issues, open monograph in social science scholarly information. Books monograph series play an important role. So we are going to discuss about setting up open monograph presses, university presses throughout the series, copyright issues and all. To start the series, we would like to have an idea about the internal norms and how social science humanities research is done in general in India, its funding status, how scholars communicate in this field, and what one should consider before arguing for open access to humanities and social science information. We have two speakers for this first symposium. We have Professor Harini Nagendra. She is an ecological researcher, and she is now the Professor of Sustainability at the Asim Premji University, and she is the Director of Research Center. Our university has a program that funds research, both extramural and intramural. So she is the Director of that center, and we would like to hear from Harini about, and she will be able to, she is a prolific writer, author, and she'll be able to give us an experience, a comparative perspective about how scholarly communication is done in science and social sciences. The second speaker, we have Professor Gopal Guru, and he is the editor of one of India's famous journals, social science journals, the Economic and Political Weekly. For me personally, it is a treasure trove. I'm interested in research policy in sciences and social sciences. Particularly, I often use this journal, and it is undisputedly it is the most famous journal in India. And Professor Gopal Guru will speak about actually how social sciences research is done and evaluated in India. So let us hear for Harini. First, I think I would like to give the room to Harini to start her presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this invitation. I think this is a very interesting symposium. And hello, everyone. I see there are 133 participants, so which is always a nice thing to see. Let me just quickly share my screen so that I can start with this. Yes, you can see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a broad canvas of issues we're trying to discuss. And as Madan said in his introduction, I am by training an ecologist, but for the past, I think 20 plus years, close to 25 plus years, I've been working also on a lot of areas that are interdisciplinary with the intersection with social sciences as well. And in that sense, it is very I would say I've engaged much less with the humanities, but now through Azim Premji University, where we have the research center, where we integrate research across the university as well as outside in all areas, I have some expertise with looking at how research in the humanities works. So the broad canvas that I want to talk about today is how should people and how do we evaluate research and recommend funding allotment? Always one has a finite pot of money and many more applicants than one has money for. So how then do we evaluate research? How do different countries evaluate it? And what should one do to recommend funding allotment? Second is from going down from the institution to the researcher. If you're a researcher in this social sciences and humanities, where does one publish? Because we see that the landscape is shrinking. There are traditional print journals, and then there are open access journals, and the space in between for a researcher, especially from the Indian context, and often from the social sciences and humanities context, which is rather poorly funded. You don't have the money for publishing, like many of the sciences areas do. That landscape is also shrinking. The third then becomes, if you are at the other level, if you are not a funding agency. So the first would be from the perspective of funding agency. How do you evaluate research and recommend where to put your funds? Like if you are ICSSR. The second is from the perspective of a researcher. Then once you've got this funding, where do you publish? The third would be from the institution's perspective, where the researcher belongs to. It's the end of the year and you're trying to evaluate who should get promotions, who should be asked to gently to step up their research output. What do you do with researchers? How does one evaluate research output of individual researchers? How does an institution peg itself against the other institutions in India looking at its research? Right? So these are three very different ways of looking at the problem, and I wanted to cover that broad scope. Since it's a very broad scope, I will necessarily have to do this at a fairly high level, but I'd be happy to discuss further in question and answers. And then I'll end with some overall thoughts on where India can go from here. Yeah. So the first question, from the perspective of a funding agency, how does one evaluate research and recommend funding allotments? Now, different countries have done this in different ways. And originally, it used to be the issue of you would evaluate each proposal on its own merit. And that is still done by a lot of people. You have a proposal, and often it's a double-blind peer review or even a blind peer review. That is, many times the reviewers do not know who the researcher is, so that information is stripped away. And the reason for that is, if you have a relatively prominent researcher who has a track record, then they get the funds. And once they've got that track record, now one can argue that if you have a researcher who has a good track record of funding, one should be funding them. And that is true. But when you have a junior researcher or somebody entering a new area, what you're doing is punishing them by such an evaluation, because they will always be ranked less in your evaluation methods if you have a reviewer-based system. The other problem that happens is, if you're a researcher from a lesser known institution or a smaller institution, again, if you're a researcher from a very prominent institution, you are more likely to get funding from a researcher than a smaller institution. So with this in mind, different countries have tried to do different approaches to evaluation. And I just want to talk about a few models that are widely known. This is not an exhaustive survey by any chance. This is just a set of different models. One is the very well-known Norwegian model. And they use a completely automated model looking at bibliometric indicators. And they evaluate research institutions across Norway, as well as parts of Belgium. Denmark uses it extensively. Finland uses it extensively. Poland uses it extensively. Parts of Sweden, some places in Sweden do, as well as the University of Dublin in Ireland. In this, they look at a system of weights. So there are different in an institution, there will be different researchers work in different fields, and that becomes not so easily comparable. For instance, let's assume that history is a much more cited field because many more people around the world are interested in history, as opposed to, say, translation in Latin. I'm just using something, I'm throwing an example out, but there are fields that are more cited. So if you just looked at citation indices, it would be unfairly biased towards historians, and no one who was working in relatively obscure but important areas would get funding. So this indicator is supposed to use a system of weights by making this more comparable across fields, and they give every institution a set of publication points. Then every institution gets a performance-based funding from the national government. So it reallocates a proportion of, so every institution gets direct institutional funding every year, irrespective of, just by the virtue that it's a government institution. In addition, there is a small proportion that is reallocated based on performance. And this, as I said, is supposed to be a very successful model. But it does have its challenges because at the end of the day, it is a bibliometric indicator. And we'll talk about problems with bibliometric indicators. But many social scientists have argued that this is actually not a very successful. This is a model with deep problems. The UK uses a different model. It's a UK, so the Norwegian model has been around since 2004. The UK Research Excellence Framework has been around since 2014. And it's developed and implemented by 4 different UK higher education funding bodies. Their aim is to provide some kind of an accountability. So it starts with the idea that public investment is going into research. Where are the benefits of this research? You must have some accountability, and that accountability is through benchmark tracking and through helping to get some kind of a reputational yardstick of the institution. And that reputational yardstick will inform the allocation of funding that institution gets for research. In that sense, so far very similar to the Norwegian model. However, this is where it differs. It's not an automatic bibliometric based. It is carried out via expert review. They have 34 subject-based panels, and those are organized into 4 groups. So the same panel for that subject will evaluate across institutions. The panel itself is interesting. There are senior academics from the UK. There are international members from outside the UK with specialization with expertise in those areas. And there are research users of different kinds because they recognize that each of these groups might have different takes on this. For instance, let's come back to history. In the UK, history works a certain way using certain frameworks. So senior academics within the UK, of course, are important. But they may be biased towards certain institutions, away from certain institutions, away from certain new ways of looking at themes. That's where international members step in. And finally, you have the case of research users. And in the research user context, it depends. There are different kinds of users, but with the idea that research is not just research for research's sake, especially in certain areas, it must impact the public. And so you look at stakeholders from different areas. When they have these panels, they assess 3 different kinds of elements. So the quality of outputs, which the bibliometric assessment would have done, but here outputs, importantly for the humanities, could not just be publications, they could also be performances and they could also be exhibitions. Secondly, it looks at the impact beyond academia. And thirdly, they look at the kind of structure that supports research. So that's the third kind of impact that they see. The UK model has also been heavily criticized by academics within the UK who complain that ever since it came in, their life has become much more bureaucratic, and they spent much of the year where they should be doing research actually trying to establish the value of their research to a bureaucratic committee that does not understand it. And this is wasted time where they can be focusing on research. And also to demonstrate impact, they say they'll end up doing a lot of things which they might not have wanted to do. So they are also looking at the tyranny of such a method which is done top down and which directs them in different directions in areas that they may not have wanted to work on. So there is a constant debate on this. Bureaucrats, on the other hand, argue that you need some kind of a national system if you're looking at natural resources to help them allocate resources. And you cannot, this is an imperfect system, but it's better than no system. Now, with all this, there are gaps And there are gaps because most of these methods, like the Norwegian system or the UK system, Australia has another system which is remarkably similar to the UK system and is also extremely top down and has also been criticized a lot. But these are nevertheless well-established systems that are functioning in these countries. They have been critiqued, especially for application to social science and the humanities. And a few of the points are in here. The first point is that bibliometric research methods are not easily adaptable to social sciences and humanities research. Why? Because in the social sciences and humanities, books, chapters in books, monographs, these are the types of publications that are often very important. They get cited. It's not the typical journal article in Science or Nature that would get cited, but a book or a monograph which establishes a writer's scholarly reputation. But bibliometric exercises, for instance, scraping the web of science, typically leave this out. Second, and this is very pertinent to a country like India, some social sciences and humanities disciplines are very characterized by pronounced national and regional orientation. And there, I think Professor Gopal Guru can speak to this much better than me. I will not get into this in great detail, but for instance, many scholars who publish in EPW, this kind of output is less visible to these databases and to this bibliometric analysis. It's not less visible in India, but it's less visible outside India for these kinds of analyses. It's also true that some of these might be written in local languages or published in regional or local publication channels that are not covered at all by these publication databases. So this is also missing. A third challenge is that social science and humanities scholars write not only for scholarly readers, but they also write for the lay public. And you'll see this if you look at influential op-eds today in many newspapers. Who are the academics who write? Take a Shiv Vishwanath, for instance, or Ramchandra Guha, or anybody else who's writing in the broad areas of social sciences and humanities. The topics that attract wide reader attention are not the niche topics of science, but really the large topics of everyday life, which is what social sciences and humanities cover. And so a good, reflective, impactful social science and humanities scholar, and we have many of these across India, really write not just for the scholarly reader, but also for the lay public. And this takes a lot of their academic time and effort and focus. And this is completely missed out from such kinds of evaluations. And the fourth is another very specific thing. The age of references is remarkably high, as so all of this is from this paper that I cited below, which essentially says that many bibliometric assessments like the Web of Science, Clarivate and Analytics, they look at 3-year citation windows or 5-year citation windows, which are more applicable to science areas where after 5 years, often knowledge gets outdated in many areas. Whereas a really masterpiece of work, for instance, in the humanities or in the social sciences, may need a 10-year citation window. It may take 5-6 years for these ideas to slowly percolate. And by the time you actually see transformations, visible transformations in scholarship because of that book or because of that monograph, it could well be 10 years, it could well be 20 years. And so, again, bibliometric research methods that are looking at 3-year, 5-year windows will simply not be able to capture this. And because of all of this, social sciences and humanities research becomes very difficult from the evaluator's point. So that was my first part. How then does an evaluator look at it? If you look at the Indian context, Madan and other colleagues have just written a very interesting paper on this. The kinds of evaluations the ICSSR or UGC or DST or many of the other institutions do, and even Indian institutions within the traditional setup of how to decide on promotions or how to decide on sharing of resources across different departments, often work on this idea of looking at impact factors, citation indices. And if you are it works well if you're in an institution, or it works, let's say, better if you're in an institution where it's largely either the sciences or largely the social sciences. So at least within that, you have some homogeneity. But if you're looking across institutions where you have a very heterogeneous setup, so that is, you have within a large institution, you have one science-based institution, let's say the Indian Institute of Science, and let's say another institution which is a pure social sciences institution and which does not get this kind of citation. Does this mean then that most of the country's money goes to science versus social science? Not to say one is more important than the other, but that we cannot have a uniform set of standards for all of these. So that's the first part. Now, what then do scholars recommend? And again, this is from a series of recommendations from this paper. So that the preferred method of evaluation could be informed peer review. So you get a peer panel like the UK does, and you get feedback. However, the problems with that is there are drawbacks, that there is a problem of subjectivity. Each panel will have its own composition, and that panel will have its own subjective methods. If you got a different panel in, also of experts from that field, you might get a very different set of rankings. So what these scholars recommend is that you must in fact have a different approach. Let's say you get together all scholars in a field and you ask them to develop what would your criteria be for quality assessment. Here you're not talking about individual faculty's assessment, but understanding what would that criteria be. And these criteria should be, they say, both those can be quantitatively measured and criteria that you say cannot be measured, but it's just your gut feeling or sense after listening to the presentation. The third thing they say is that it should not be only academic criteria for research performances. You must get other stakeholders, societal stakeholders, and ask them for their criteria. And this must be made transparent, because you must understand that what is important for academics is different from what is important for other kinds of stakeholders, who could be policymakers, who could be government, who could be regular public at large, right? And finally, they say a very important thing, that you should not have a rating or a ranking with one overall measure. 1.46, let's say, is your impact factor. You have a set of different criteria. Each gives you something very different. Transparently publish the entire thing so people can look at the variation, and each institution itself decide what is important. Right? So with that, this is a broad sweep of how does a funding organization assess. Let's move to the second level. Let's say you're an individual, you have got this funding from a research organization, and excellent, congratulations to you. Where does one publish then? What's the situation in the Indian landscape? The situation in the Indian landscape is of shrinking access to journals. There were traditional journals that Indian authors always published in. They don't charge authors publication charges. However, they're inaccessible to readers because they're behind a paywall. You have to pay to get access. If you're lucky, you're in an institution which has library access, and so you just have to log into your library and you get access to the article. But even for libraries, speaking from the perspective of even our university and universities across the US, across Europe, prices of these journals are going up, rocketing sky high. So many very well-funded, the University of California system, those kinds of universities also, let alone universities in India, are actually refusing to buy subscriptions to journals such as Elsevier because they simply cannot afford them. The prices are going up. And this is steadily becoming a problem in many Indian institutions. Therefore, academics in many Indian institutions have lacked access, and some go to options like Sci-Hub, and we all know about the controversial Sci-Hub case that is running right now in India and being addressed in the court. Right. So since that's in court, I'm not going to talk too much about that. But what does so you as an author, you're in a peculiar place. You can publish, but the audience you're speaking to, which is largely an Indian audience first, rather than an international audience, will not be able to read your books or read your papers because they're behind a scientific card. And then many well-cited traditional print journals are moving away to open access models. So if you look at many of the large publishing houses, many of their best cited journals are moving to gold access, which is essentially saying they initially started with this idea that you can publish open access or you can pay. So, you can publish in the traditional print way, or you can pay for open access. Now, steadily, they're moving to the idea that you have to pay for open access in many of these journals, and the pay charges are very high. In fact, here's a tweet that somebody recently tweeted. Nature has started with these free articles. Free articles is free for readers, not free for people who want to publish in Nature. And this is the comparison of a free article, one article in Nature, as opposed to a UGC professor, a postdoc, or CSIR PhD, or a Gates stipend. And you'll see that it's more than an annual salary of a professor. So how are Indians supposed to access this? So this is the problem when you have a growing culture of open access journals. The culture is that you have high publication charges. They're free for, but they're open to readers. In this context, we know that there are many predatory journals that have flourished. They have flourished, even the journals that are not predatory. There is a vested interest for journals to accept more publications because that's their revenue model, accepting more publications. And in both models, there's a significant voluntary contribution of academic reviewers and editors, all of us, that keeps the system ticking. But we don't profit. Or academia as a whole, forget us individually, academia as a whole does not profit, publishers profit. Society journals are a possible way forward. These are individual societies that publish these, so they make it possible to do open access for readers without publication charges for authors. But they require some significant financial support by some organization. Often it's a specific society of academics, or it could be a different kind of an organization, and volunteer support from an editorial and support team. This is most successful in the West, but there is a growing list from India. And I want to give 4 examples very quickly. In the social sciences and humanities, one is Ecology, Economy and Society, the INSEE journal, and I was one of the part of the founding editorial team. I'm not there anymore. This is from the Journal of the India. It's from the Indian Society for Ecological Economics. It offers authors a forum to address social environmental issues from across and within the natural and social sciences. And it's now been running it's now in its 3rd year. It's recognized by UGC and doing successfully. Getting funding support is always a challenge for journals like this. The second is the Resonance Journal of Science Education, which has built a formidable reputation for itself in the area of science education in India. From 1996 onwards, it has been running and supported by the Indian Academy of Sciences, with co-publishing with Springer outside India. The third is also the Indian Academy of Sciences. It's called Dialogue, and it's a forum for scientists and other parties to discuss and debate issues pertaining to science and society. So the practice of science, the communication of science to the public, and the impact of science on society and society on science. Very interesting, relatively recent journal, also supported by the Indian Academy of Sciences. And the fourth is Conservation and Society, which is looking at a bridge between conservation practice and scholarship in the social and natural sciences, as well as the humanities. This is supported by an institution, the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment. Again, has been running for a long time, fairly successfully. Okay. So these are the ways forward that Indian research, these are all 4 are very India-specific, India-relevant journals. And we really need more pathways like this, I think, so that we can publish in the Indian context. Now, my third point, how does one evaluate the research output of individual researchers? So we started with the funding agency and how that would decide on evaluation. And then researchers have got funds and where would you publish it? Now, if you're looking at it from the organization perspective, how does one evaluate and compare the research output of individual researchers? And surely you would need to do that at some point for annual evaluations. Now, every researcher is different. And I'll give you some examples from our own experiences. You might have multilingual academics with very deep interest in regional literature who works on translations. Someone who makes very important Indian work in regional languages accessible to a wider audience. This is very significant work from the Indian context, completely outside your bibliometric databases, etc. There's no way you will be able to track it if you use your traditional models. Such research will be deemed insignificant from the university or institution's point of view, unless that institution starts thinking more broadly. So we have been trying to wrap our heads around how to do this. It's easier at smaller scales, and we spend a lot of time doing this every year, but it's very difficult when it becomes, let's say, an institution which has, I don't know, 500 faculty. How would you do this? We've still not figured out good ways of doing this. I'll give another example. If you're a researcher working on GIS mapping of public health institutions across rural India, or any other kinds of public databases, you're spending so much of your time creating a public database that can be used widely by media, by researchers, by policymakers. Again, there are no outputs. Your output is the public database. But it's hugely significant in terms of the transformative impact it has of allowing for this kind of large impact. Or a scholar who does traditional scholarship, you see 0 outputs for 7 years, after which you have a magnum opus of a book, because the scholar has been thinking very deeply and doing a lot of detailed work for 7 years before she publishes something. How are you supposed to evaluate these? It's very easy for the traditional kind of, let's say, a paper a year, a book in 2 years, or book in 3 years. How do we evaluate these three kinds, for instance? And these become very important for us. So we are using the approach that every researcher is different and we don't follow these kinds of approaches. But as I said, this is not always possible when you scale. How do we do this then? The possibilities of multi-level evaluations. For instance, you have one level of evaluation where you do it by peers from the same specialized subdiscipline, not within your university or institution, but outside the university, so that you don't have that kind of bias. You speak for the quality of the work, the ideas, and the broader impact. The second is by people within, because when you want to completely eliminate bias, you also eliminate personal knowledge. So you must have people within that university or institution who know the person and can give you soft inputs that are invaluable. And the third is self-evaluation by that scholar themselves about what they feel about their trajectory, and repeat a combination of these evaluations over time. This is one example of how to do this. This is not the only way to do this, but essentially you must have a combination of evaluations. Now, with that, I see we're at 3:06, and I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. And I see that there are a lot of questions coming up in the audience. I'll just end with a few slides. Just a second. What can India do as a pan-Indian steps to address some of these issues? I think we also need pan-Indian databases, because one of the big challenges is where do we publish, and the fact that what we publish is not always trackable in the standard bibliographic metrics. So there are two options that I think we can use as models. One is archive.org, which physics uses extremely widely, and so does now many other fields, including quantitative biology. It's a free distribution, open access archive. You just put up your paper. So you might, let's say if I'm a physicist and I'm submitting to a physics journal, I first put it up on archive.org, a preprint, and then it goes to the journal for review, etc. And the issue there is that the journals also accept that it can also go, an alternative version can go on archive.org. You see the numbers that there are of these articles, 1.8 million and counting and growing. Materials are not peer reviewed. So this is very simple. This is completely fed by scholars themselves. Or the Digital Library of the Commons from Indiana University, set up by Eleanor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom. And this was set up as a free and open access to text, articles, papers, dissertations on the Commons. And again, it's self-loaded by authors, and Indiana University keeps this database going. Both of these require significant amounts of funding and investment. This is not cheap. However, even if it's not peer reviewed, so you need to have some significant support. But these are not steps an institution can take on their own. It has to be pan-Indian, and it has to be with some significant funding support. But these are the kinds of important steps. We have nothing like this in the social sciences and humanities, at least not that I'm aware of, which is global or even pan-Indian, and we really should be looking for something like this. And I'll just end with one last wrap-up. I don't know if you have seen this, but there are these annual analyses which were doing the rounds about 2 months ago, and there are two of them. One is Clarivate, which runs the Web of Science. They do an annual analysis of the 1% top researchers globally. And this is to recognize scholars with multiple highly cited papers for science and social science, not humanities, but science and social science. They have a broad category called social science, which is a one-size-fits-all category. They do some weightage for the fact that certain fields are more cited than the others. They have 200 top cited researchers in their category or their bucket called social science. Of these 200, we have none from India. And while that, this is one thing. The other field related to social science in there is business and economics. There they have 101 top cited researchers, and there's one with an Indian affiliation, but this Indian affiliation person, I looked him up, he's really based in the US and has a visiting affiliation with a institution in India. So you can say none in India. Now, the other, apart from Clarivate, is an analysis from some researchers at Stanford University, and they do this irregular kind of assessment of the top 5% scholars in every field. And there was a lot of discussion on social media with different scholars popping up saying, we are on this top 5% list. But there is very little in the social sciences. In economics, there is no scholar from India. In history, there are 3 from India. And again, the numbers are very few. Yet as a country, we can't say that we don't have good social science and humanities. As a country, I think we have some stellar social science and stellar work in humanities in a very different direction. So this clearly tells us that our evaluations are not doing a good job, and there's a need for some kind of major systemic overhaul along all the directions that I was talking about, in deciding how to allocate funds, in looking at more avenues for publication, and finally doing a better system of our evaluation, which is not biased so much against the humanities and social sciences. With that, I'll end, and I'm happy to take questions now or later if, Madan, if you want to just continue. You're on mute. You're on mute again.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah. We will invite Professor Gopal Guru to continue he will speak about how social science research is done and evaluated. And meanwhile, you can, I would request all the participants to type their questions in question answer mode so that we will get the questions properly. And meanwhile, as soon as the second talk is over, I think it will be comfortable for me to take up a few questions and answer it. Thank you so much. May I invite Professor Gopal Guru to take up the role? Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to share this panel with our distinguished colleague who just spoken just now. This is an important initiative in as much as it focuses on the question of evaluating research in social sciences and humanities. And Madan, you made a very interesting point that, one nation, one subscription is an interesting idea. Everything is one nation and one subscription these days. And I don't know what are they going to achieve out of it. But it clearly shows that there is a discriminatory attitude between the two. I mean, you can make natural science journals in natural sciences and physical sciences free access so that people can really access them. But what do they do? When they access, what do they do? What do they achieve? Common, if you really want to expand the social basis of evaluation of natural journals in natural sciences, what do you want to do? That hypothetically it is fine, but you have to have some kind of significance to this hypothesis. What do you want to do? Is the lead question that we should ask to those people who are actually proposing this one nation, one subscription. This is the most valid question I think we should ask. Even there are critics of science journals and all that. Instead of really taking their view into consideration, you are actually imposing your role model. As if social science and humanities have, they can be left to fend for themselves. But I'm not upset completely about this whole scheme, but access to any scholarship, any knowledge is important, whether it is in physical sciences or in social sciences, humanities. Because it actually sets a twofold agenda of evaluation. After all, there are several agendas of evaluation, and we just have no time to really cover all that. And there are only two, as far as I can see. One is you are actually evaluating your research in social science and humanities in terms of evaluating the performance of the government and the state. State which is funding scholarship, state which is funding scholarship everywhere, and the state which is actually institutionalizing scholarship. That's why keeping state in mind while evaluating research in social sciences becomes cardinally important. Therefore, you need to ask this question. You want to access research in social sciences because you want to also access the performativity, as they say very famously, of the government, policies and programs. And which are those social scientists who are actually doing research on these subjects on the question of performance? So that is one criteria of evaluating research. That's why I want to access. Whether I want to buy access facility or not, that's a different question. That's a more pragmatic question. I'm not going to go into it. If the evaluation has some bearing on my day-to-day, and as I think Professor Nagendra was mentioning that, I will have to actually look at that research which is dealing with the evaluation of policies and programs of the government. And I can't be lazy about it. And so therefore, in that sense, the social basis of evaluation can be expanded only on this criteria. One set of criteria is evaluating the programs and policies of the government, because government itself has a moral responsibility to fund research in terms of performance, in terms of the good of the society, in terms of the welfare of the society. But then what do these research scholars do is the question. Are they really providing research that is sufficiently critical of the programs? And are they really providing research which is recommendatory in character, rectificatory in character? I mean, the program policies are good, but you need to do a little more, improve upon it. There is no complete, solid critique of the program. You are actually trying to accommodate whatever policies are there, which are happening there. So in a way, social scientists of certain kinds reduce themselves to the official intellectuals. So if you are producing research which is not sufficiently critical, which is not sufficiently detecting the limits of the program, then I think I don't want to access that research. So it's a moral question. Is the question accessing is not a mechanical, practical, pragmatic, utilitarian question. It's a moral, deeply moral, philosophical question, and that we have to actually keep in mind. But then I think it's really painful to see that certain research proposal that we get, and we evaluate them through certain bodies, certain academic bodies. Those proposals which actually are recommendatory in character are approved and funded. Those which are critical, I'm not talking about the present dispensation. I don't know whether they are really doing any evaluation right now. I don't know. But assessment of those proposals which actually are terribly against the programs, and they are actually in line with, they accommodate those programs, those proposals are funded. So therefore, you find 2-3 paragraphs in research proposal. One is the scenario, assessment, recommendations, and conclusion. That's it in the research proposal. So, I mean, how does it really help in actually informing the government critically that you need to really do something which has to be fundamentally different than what you have been doing all these years? But that research doesn't come forward. So this is one. So I think before we go for any kind of assessment, evaluation, you have to answer this question. The other big problem is about, Dr. Nagendra has already mentioned that, social compared to social sciences, physical sciences are a darling destination. People keep quoting them. And I don't have any relative deprivation. Let them quote. Sometimes, scholars they end up referring themselves in the same article. Why do they want to really write article, therefore, if they want to put it themselves? And Foucault has said, no, you can build up your own career by quoting yourself, self-quoting. You become, so that, of course, some referencing and all that is important, but I won't really give any much credence to that. We have a deeper problem. Natural sciences, of course, and then Professor Nagendran has already pointed out the issues there. Why is that? Social sciences do not really get favorable response on the people. They do not get quoted. The references are actually lacking. But the question is actually in social sciences, by and large, you have a different kind of problem. Social sciences readers, enlightened readers, and I am included in that, teachers, students, research scholars, all of them, how much do they read? How much do they read? How much do they read critically? How familiar are they with the debates, status of the debate in social sciences, particularly about poverty, inflation, exclusion, humiliation? How informed, how up to date they are about all these debates, status of debates, and as she has mentioned, that it takes about 7 to 8 years to get you to get you little critical scholarly attention. Why is this? It's not simply to gain access, but you are not ready to get access to material that is readable. And you, as the enlightened librarian, you tell me what is the access, how many people come, and all this now. Now, since I also sat on committees evaluating, and I did research myself. I do research again. I'm not stop researching, but at the moment I'm actually managing and mobilizing scholarship. And we have a certain degree of difficulties. I don't want to share that with you about the kind of quality of scholarship that we get. But we really have a serious problem of readership and critical evaluation of our own scholarship. So unless that comes forward, it will not be worthwhile to really compare ourselves with natural sciences. How much are they really referred to? How much we are referred to? That doesn't really have any kind of significance at the moment. So I will not be much bothered about this relative deprivation point between the natural sciences and the social sciences. We should actually address this internal question of how much are we really, how much are we ready to debate ourselves. The scholar, just find out in all the social science journals what is the last point, what is the last page. Is there a discussion page? Is there a debating page? Is there a comment page? Just find out. So I think this is something which is common across board. We do get critical comments through letters and all that in EPW. And we also carry sometimes comments. But our earnest desire is that people come back to us with new points, new insights, new critical, even devastating criticism of a particular piece in EPW. But that rarely happens actually. So I think it's the internal point that we should keep in mind. The other problem is how do we communicate? What is one is government, the other evaluative point is that how much role your research in social science and humanities play in terms of actually conscientizing, improvising critical consciousness of the society. When I'm saying critical consciousness, I'm not being pedantic or pedagogical. I'm saying my duty as a research scholar is to really create intellectual conditions within which discursive energies of common people can sprout. I don't want to give them. It's not a top-down approach. Actually, it's like Spider-Man. People have energies, and the energies are like Spider-Man. You need to provide some kind of conditionality so within which they can actually sprout, they can flourish their own critical discursive energies. But we shouldn't be pedantic. We should not be giving them material. This is something which is the job of research scholar and his or her research work. But the point is this, that many a time we do follow research protocols that are followed by natural sciences. That is to say, your method, your content, your language, and your purpose. All these will really decide the criteria for evaluation. And those, therefore, doing research becomes a protocol question. That you need to follow a particular method. You can't seek deviation. You need to have certain content. to it. You can't have arbitrary content to it. The content which is commonly agreed upon. The language has to be universal, standardized. You can't have it in a private language. And your purpose has to actually improve science, not society. Sorry, I'm just saying. You have to improve science, but whether you improve society or not, that's a different secondary question. Like, I will really protect my discipline and enrich my discipline. For the sake of my discipline, I will actually do research. But what connection does it have to everyday, to social relationship, to social consciousness? Are you making any headway? I am Sundar Saruk. I did 2 books actually. One is Cracked Mirror, and I don't know how long is it taking for people to follow Cracked Mirror. Cracked Mirror actually does exactly this: the everyday experience and research. And the second book. I'm sorry, I'm referring to my own self. I mean, this is out of sheer humility, not arrogance. So I think this is the point that one is raising, that, once you reduce open scholarship, the scholarship in Republican content, to a law-like situation, a rule that you need to follow method, content, language, and purpose, you are actually protecting your own discipline rather than expanding the scholarship and doing something very good to the society. This happens to, this has happened to social sciences, that is natural sciences, that's why they're dominating. They continue to dominate. And social sciences and humanities, particularly philosophy, is actually, philosophy, of course, is, and I think Sundar Saruka is a noble exception in this, that philosophy is unto itself. It is actually not opening out, and that is my complaint about them. They have followed this protocol question. They have reduced philosophy to rules that no one can really enter. Trespasser will be prosecuted. I'm just using a very harsh word, but that is the reality. And so you actually want to, in a way, do research, do philosophy, study philosophy, only to maintain, protect its purity. And you are a pure philosophy. You can take a flight into metaphysics and cosmology. Fine. But what about the everyday? And that's why this barefoot philosopher of Sundar Saruka and others is actually making a headway in terms of opening up philosophical studies for its critical, open, widely based evaluation. I mean, your disciplines will not actually progress unless it is not widely appreciated and evaluated. It is not expert to expert. Natural sciences, as he has already mentioned, natural sciences, expert to expert, is a very narrow elitization. It's an evaluation is actually caught between the two poles. One is elitization, the other one is subordination. And unfortunately, we don't really give credence to it. And regional journals in social sciences published in mother tongues, vernacular is not the right word, are actually doing that. They are actually expanding the critical base of evaluation. Not so much the English journals. I mean, EPW should be exception to this anyway. But so this is the point that one is actually raising is the critical evaluation has to be done outside the protocol. It began with philosophy and it actually entered in social sciences. I'll just take one example. You mentioned history. History is very, very important. No one mentions political science for, I don't know what reason, but it's there. But certain disciplines like economics, I think I saw a friend from Bhubaneswar. He was there. So he will, I'll also address him. Manikanji Mishra. So, I mean, how do you communicate your research? And whom do you communicate to? If you're there, but you're there.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just. So I'm just referring to economics. I thought I'll just refer to you since I saw your page. So I mean, just take one example from economics, econometrics basically. That you are doing research on exclusion, poverty, inflation, and humiliation. For example, 3, exclusion. What kind of language do you use to actually grasp this reality, which is complex, and how do you want to communicate it to people so that you get wider appreciation and evaluation? Most of the time, and we keep getting these articles, I won't name the scholars, highly graphic, sophisticated, formulaic, in graphs, in simulation. I mean, exclusion, humiliation, caste atrocities, gender atrocities, injustice, all these are existential, ontologically related to your everyday experience. When you are actually approximating them, the proximity, which is so undesirable, is approximated in terms of abstract language. What does it achieve? It achieves 2 things. It actually enriches your discipline, fine. It communicates to whom? Experts in the field who can understand this language. And so you have, I have no problem with that. But is that the basis of your critical evaluation? Is the question. So there is, I would say, I will use a very harsh word, the language of methodological fallacy. And I'll just give one example of fallacy. Once you elevate this research on exclusion, for example, to the level of abstraction in graphics and other things, what do? Actually, you forget the kind of treatment that common people with certain kind of consciousness give to these concepts. For example, what we find in this social consciousness is a phenomenological turn. And we have done this, myself and Sundar again. And I'm just inviting people to read those two volumes. It's a humble request. That the social consciousness, which is required to appreciate the scholarship in humanities, particularly, narratives, in this whole language, in this abstraction, graphic language, protocol language, narratives have no business to appear. Actually, when you are, in a way, you can take credit for minimizing the words used and capturing maximum social reality. That much economy, the economists will achieve, and I will grant them this credibility. Okay, that you are actually economizing the word used. And therefore, narratives in literature, poetry are not desirable. They are not required, so to say. Just as philosophy will be scared of reducing itself to poetry, and they will take all that care, similarly here also, you will use little words to express more reality. That is your claim. And therefore, narratives about poverty, Adam Smith's first work, Theory of Moral Sentiment, or Professor Amartya Sen's writings on poverty, and he takes a flight into it. It's really poetic at some level. So all that is ruled out. How much loss we actually incur by actually rendering the language, rendering the social reality into a very abstract language. So that's the point I thought I should have covered earlier. But anyway, that it has come to me just now. So the point one is raising is in terms of what is the fallacy. The fallacy is this, that in our Indian social consciousness, a particular kind of social consciousness, as it is there in the US as well, or in the UK, and they don't talk about it in the UK, this actually has a typical moment, this consciousness at the phenomenological level, that it actually achieves the overlap between the cognitive and the symbolic. What do I mean by this? It actually, the concept of social justice is cognitively produced at some level, yes. It has to be treated likewise, accordingly. It cannot be juxtaposed or it cannot be superimposed on another category. So it has a purpose. It has an epistemic purpose. But in our country, we reduce it to practical use. You use social justice to describe certain caste as social justice categories. You don't have to use Dalit or Adivasi. You just use a social justice. So that kind of a cognitive overlap, cognitive and the symbolic overlap is lost when you actually, when you elevate studies the reality of exclusion to the level of abstraction in graphics. And this is the fallacy. If you are doing this, why should I be interested in your research? I should be interested in your research because it helps your discipline, it helps your community to stay together and defend the discipline. So you can actually defend and protect your individuality to discipline. What about the larger social reality? Is the question that is worth evaluating. These are few issues. I thought I have another example. I'll just stop here, Madan, and then we can have. I have sufficiently broke people. I think there should be some discussion on this, and let's wait for the interaction session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor Harni Nagendra and Professor Gopal Guru. There are about 16 questions. Let me start with a question to Professor Gopal Guru. I understand all the problems within this assimilation of research ideas, even if it is accessible. Even if I display thousands of books in my library, there are a number of users are limited. The evaluation based on like communication of languages in mother tongue particularly, all these points are important. But as you say in your book, The Cracked Mirror, the first chapter claims, I think you put forward a kind of egalitarian approach is essential for social science research. I would say access to information is probably the key point to achieve that, whether it is theoretical research or empirical research. The problem is only a few institutions in our country are able to have access to the books that you write. I read the book in Tamil which was translated after so many years by an individual scholar who is not associated with any institution, or somebody volunteer his time and translate the title. Then I read it. It took so many years for getting your ideas for me to read, just as you say, for scholarship pleasure. So not many libraries display these kind of books. They are not able to. They are not very well funded. At least these kind of public funded, authors working in the public funded institutions, they have to come forward to make it more accessible, widely accessible. Even if it is not properly read or assimilated by others. I think we need to have a critical number, get access to it so that the quality can manifest in terms of citations and others. So what I would propose is, irrespective of all this, I think the access to information, whether it is published in journal articles or monographs or books, and which are translated into other Indian languages. So the access problem is very critical here. Many universities which teach economics, political sciences, particularly the state-funded universities, are not able to spend as much money as they should spend. That is one problem that I would like to highlight. And there are many questions. Would you like to take up answer this question? Meanwhile, I will organize the question and answer session. Thank you.
I'd be happy to answer some of them.
Yeah, I will read. So this question is for both, probably Professor Gopal Guru. Why most of the social science society journals are not Scopus indexed? So this is the problem. indexed. University, IIT, IIM prefer scope of Web of Science indexed journal paper only for PhD and postdoc. What will scholars do? Institutions are not encouraging. This is the question. This is one question. Would Professor Gopal Guru would you be able to answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question can be answered by Professor Nagendra.
Yeah.
Why don't you answer this question? I mean, I would say yes. The question is, I mean, she can give a more authentic, elaborated answer to this question. But Scopus, of course, we have, but we require all these international reference points so that we can actually evaluate ourselves. There should be somebody to really tell us where we stand. But who should tell us is the question. Yeah, we require somebody who has, I mean, standing and who is really serious. So I think it is important to have some evaluative body so that you can position yourself vis-a-vis the observations made by that body. So Scopus, of course, is required. And people who are actually researching in social science and humanities should take this invitation seriously. It's not a critique, it's an invitation that you should really, in the light of the ranking, so to say, you have to actually organize yourself. And so you require, this is a bit of a liberal agenda in a sense that no, today I am on the top, tomorrow you are going to be on the top with me. So that kind of aspiration, that kind of hope is there, that is generated through this kind of evaluative practices done by Scopus and other evaluative bodies at the international level. And there is one academic now, and they keep sending me several things, and you have quoted 1,000 quotations are there now that, but I don't know how much one is driven by this kind of a modernity thrust. Oh my God, the sky is the limit for me. I can reach there, but will I be able to reach down with my own people? Is my moral, ethical question that I always face. It's a moral dilemma for me. Yeah, she can actually.
So I think you've already answered it, Professor Guru, quite comprehensively. The one thing I can add is, as he said, that it depends on the interest of the society itself. So the editor can always approach Scopus. This does not require any payment. And for many of these citation aggregators or databases, there are different criteria. So some of them require that you should have been around as a journal for 3 or 4 years. Some of them require that you should have at least so many papers published in a year. And then you just approach them to get onto the database. They do some verification and then they add you on. So it's not there are no barriers there in terms of gatekeeping, because the financial model for these search engines or citation aggregators is to have more and more journals indexed. So in that sense, now the larger question is, which is difficult to answer, which Professor Guru has pointed to, is why should all journals have to do this to make sure that, so it's a critique of the system itself, which is very valid. But really for a journal itself, it's a fairly easy process. So it's a question of why are the journals not approaching and getting this done? There was another question similarly saying that I would like to publish in Learning Curve, for instance, which may be more useful for practitioners, but as a research scholar, UGC will not accept it. I think there it becomes challenging because you need UGC acceptance. You can definitely approach UGC to say, why cannot you add something like Learning Curve? But the challenge here is you need to prove that it is peer reviewed. And I think that is one sort of standard for all of these journals, that we must show that there is some sort of peer review process that goes through with before publication. And unless one can show that, those journals will simply not be considered valid. Now, one can always argue that therefore UGC should broaden its standards, because in certain areas of practice, maybe peer review is not what you want. What you want is to communicate with practitioners more effectively. So that's a larger systemic question which requires a different kind of thinking. Within the system, this is what one can do. Try and find journals and take it to the attention of UGC, maybe as a group of people.
I would like to add about this particular question of indexing journals in Scopus kind of secondary information sources. This creates enormous visibility because they have They have the marketing skills to demonstrate their products. They are available in Western libraries and everywhere. If your paper, if EPW's papers are indexed, they get more visibility, of course. But they would expect a critical number of citations in the next couple of years or something. The papers should get cited. If they are not cited, even if they are rich in content or something, but if they are not cited, these databases would not want to index these journals which are not really making any citation based impact, I would say, carefully. So they will not index these. See, for example, Economic and Political Weekly is the only journal from India indexed by, there are many journals indexed by economics journals indexed by Scopus, published from India. But even EPW on its website has claimed that it is, top second in, in the number of journals indexed by Scopus. Second journal in Asia. The first journal is again sponsored by the Korean Academy of Sciences, one economics journal. That is falling under the quartile 1 in terms of the number of citations a particular journal accumulates. But none of these journals are able to enter into the quartile 1 list of these Scopus index journals. Even EPW is in quartile 2. So they are not able to accumulate citations. Citation is the main parameter for these databases to index your index a particular journal. So this really restricts visibility of the work produced from India. So that is when I think we have to really have a kind of portal, as Latin American research councils have done. They have accumulated all the Indian journals into a portal. They wanted to improve the technical qualities of these journals. They want to be indexed in DOAJ kind of other indexes and creating visibilities that we have to do. But I'm not sure UGC is also taking a kind of rough measure. I think they will be, considering journals indexed by these kind of databases, either Web of Science or Social Science, citation index or Scopus. So the main problem is these journals are not indexed in famous databases. They are working in silos. They are not able to get the visibility, the due visibility that it should get. So this is one problem that we have identified through this discussion. We can discuss it in the coming meetings. And one question to Hari is that what's startling for me is that why authors who review articles spending their time and resources on journals and even never asked publishers for sharing profits. Why do you want to do this? Even journals mint money. At least the journals produced from Western Europe and Northern America they are registering at least 40% profit every year. Then why do you want to donate your time for increasing the wealth of the shareholders? This is a very valid question. Yeah.
Very valid question. I could not. I started typing an answer, but I realized this needs. It's one of those things where you're stuck in a system, and you cannot reform the system alone, and then you get stuck in, sort of sucked into it to maintain. All of us need to publish, and the reality is it's very difficult to overthrow these systems. What has worked? I mean, having sat on a number of these things from all sides, right? From as an author, as a reviewer, as an editor at various levels in the journals, and I'm on different kinds of journals. Society journals I work with the Standard, Elsevier, Sage, Springer, etc., and with open access journals. It's very difficult as a sort of a one individual. It's very difficult. What works well has been the society journal format. So conservation letters, for instance, and conservation biology are the two top conservation journals which are run by the Society for Conservation Biology. And of course, it's published by Wiley, but really it's a society-specific journal. So you feel like, and there are certain, so you have to pay for open access fees. But one of the things the society has done while negotiating is that any author who cannot pay for any reason whatsoever has to just make that transparent. And you will get if your paper is accepted, then fees will not come in the way of publication. So those are the things you can do with society journal. But the amount of time and effort that takes is simply exhausting. And frankly, after a year or two, most of us burn out and get out of that. and you still want to contribute in some way, so you continue with this. It's a vicious system. At some point there needs to be a large group that comes together and demands reform. But what is the reform? The reform cannot be the kind of open access journals that are mushrooming, because that is another kind of barrier. I find as a writer now, I'm priced out of many of the journals that I would like to publish in. So the quid pro quo, so to speak, that one can do with some of these journals is that if you review a certain number of papers, or you are on the editorial board, then you can get a free paper a year or 50% off. And I typically use that for PhD students who need publications then to get their PhD. So there's always something. As a system, it's not very good. I think as each of us as individuals, we find our way, especially to get the most vulnerable, which is our students, out of this jam. But yeah, the system absolutely needs overhaul.
Yeah.
If I could just give a 45-second comment, I take reviewing as our academic social responsibility. And if we don't do that, we should have no right to criticize corporations for failing in their corporate social responsibility. And now they created CSR, should do ASR. I know it's a tough job, but we all have to do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Of course, as a reviewer, we get the hot information in first hand. We will get access to the nascent ideas, and because of it is a voluntary enterprise, we are.
I think the point.
Canonical archive.
Can I just respond to Professor Bani's? I think he's making a very important point. And then he's speaking my mind. Actually, we require to have this ASA, academic social responsibility, for really reviewing things and reviewing things freely. And free in terms of time and your patience, actually. But that normally, and he's a preview to what the problem that lots of people face. And so I think it is important that, and if you really want to increase the social basis of evaluation, you must really adopt this responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is fine. I don't know whether there's a passage between the two, but and there is no passage, I guess. We have to have academic social responsibility to do review for at least social journals in social sciences, not only in English but also in the vernaculars. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. One second. Yeah.
Can I just add to
Yeah.
that?
The next.
Sorry, just one thing to say. So somebody who
Yes, please.
hello,
Maya, to ask a question.
saying that it's startling that authors who review articles have never asked publishers for sharing the profits, right? So already in a way academia has worked on a pro bono model. It's not that anybody's monetized their academic labor in any great way. Given that story and given the fact that with digital and other platforms, multilingual is actually possible, and that India delivers in terms of numbers, right? We have the scale, we have the appetite, we have the need. In talking about the creation of sort of alternative ecosystems, right? And especially with the emphasis everywhere now on decolonizing these infrastructures, it seems that if we also used a multilingual model, right? The way in which you count impact might also change, because you'll have to account for other registers, not only, the ones that exist already. So the creation of another sort of nascent, ecosystem, I think, is begging to be born in every way. And maybe that can also create the beginning of a pressure group, whether it's to UGC and, thinking about their lists and also what PhD scholars require in terms of publishing. Sorry, that's it.
Thank you very much, Professor Mayador. And the next question is, what
Your image has become frozen. Madan, I can't.
What are the major issues in India that we don't have? I mean, am I audible? Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. Single name in the whenever we are counting the citation-based ranks when we make So why we are not able to, this, in social sciences also, we are not able to see highly cited papers published in, if you put together all the journals published in social sciences, why we are not able to produce highly cited scientists in India? What could be the reason, Professor Gopal Guru?
I think this it's a subjective reading of a person who's highly cited, either in terms of number of quotations or in terms of engagement with the argument. If you are actually countering the argument at different places, that would be, I think, much higher in rating than simply quoting in numbers. I mean, I'm being nasty now, cynical in a way, that people have a politics of citing and there's intimate citing. I think that problem is there. So you manage to quote. I mean, that's the point that I'm making. Your ideas need to be cited, and ideas need to be engaged at different places. That is the real substantive citation, not how many times you are cited. I mean, you are actually repeating, and the repetitions are they? I mean, you can feel happy that you are becoming an idea. But are you becoming a counter? Are you becoming a counter idea? That question is not answered. You can be reproduced as an idea many times, anywhere, but that only means that you are not thinking afresh. There's no critical insight. You are actually at the receiving end. Do you want to be at the receiving end all the time, or you should be countering the idea, which is actually a modular form idea? So that is the definition of referencing, not some kind of a mechanical, sequential kind of referencing. Okay, I'm not saying that you should be Bhudeva, you don't require any reference and you are self-referential, but you have to actually see in terms of the critical engagement of your ideas at different places. That's how I will actually define referencing. Otherwise, it becomes a sheer mechanical, customary exercise.
So, but when it comes to citations, of course, we can see the citations in context. But for example, your book, The Cracked Mirror, has been cited more than 140 times. But I look at the world through literature, through databases. But if anything cited more than 100 times is somewhat has made some addition to that particular field, whether it is positive or negative, I can't ignore this number here. Why?
I'm happy to hear that, Maran.
Yeah. So what we would like to know is the value of citations, references in social science literature. Do you have any comments about the actual value of citations, even if it is citations, self-referencing? Apart from that, do you think that citations in
yes, it is. I mean, it is important. I'm not discounting. I'm just trying to actually give a different dimension to the definition of referencing. That's the point I'm making. Originally, referencing is important because it actually keeps you in touch with the scholarship, and both the author and the respondent to that particular. So it plays a very important role in terms of actually organizing the boundaries of the debate, and then also actually in a way deciding the future of this particular idea or argument that is produced at particular point in time. So I think it is so important. It is let us not be self-effacing. It has to be there. It has to be there, and people feel happy about it. Why not? They should feel happy about it because they are invested so much in producing one single argument. After all, we are not comparing, but Rawls took about 21 years to produce one single volume of theory of justice, and now it has gone into 7 lakh printing and also more than 6,000. This is the old figure I'm giving you. 6,000 commentaries in different languages all over the world. So that's classic in a way. Now you require to, but there are people who are actually building onto that. Actually, referencing, like there are a parallel team of people, scholars, philosophers, who actually engage with Professor Sir John Rawls. So that's a different kind of referencing I was referring to. So you actually give a credence, some kind of a essence to your referencing. But the other kind of reference is also important because that it keeps you in touch, on track. So important. Apart from it makes you happy and elevated to some extent.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. There is one specific question for you. Your comment on ideological capture of social science funding institutions, which discourages objective funding of projects. What is your comment about this statement, Professor Gopal Guru?
No, it's not ideological. It's political. It's no whatever is. You can be from any ideology. If it is not, it is going to be highly critical. Some kind of a moderate criticism is tolerated by a liberal government. Okay, but the point is, you actually keep in mind your own reputation, and the reputation should not be assaulted by any kind of a harsh criticism, though the criticism is very, very valid and legitimate. That space is shrinking. It is shrinking. So I would say it is not ideological. Sometimes it could be, but it is more political. And what is political is basically ideological as well. But I'm just using a milder version of ideological because it is processed through politics. Ideology doesn't get processed on its own; it processed through politics. So that happens anytime in any government. Okay.
Thank you, sir. One question to Harini. Common repository databases in the social sciences will be useful in advancing robust research. What are your thoughts on issues of ethics for creating and sharing such repositories? Probably the question is related to the legitimacy of making open access to the contents the way archive in biosciences are doing. Harini, would you be able to take up this question?
I think this is a very important question. And again, I was trying to type an answer, but it was one of those things that require much more deep engagement. See, like you have ethics committees in universities, you need a proper ethics committee that spans different types of work and different methodological approaches to actually come up with guidelines. But some of the guidelines I can think of straight away. For instance, don't share photographs or videos with faces clearly identified without consent. Or even in cases, definitely don't share identification of village names or location names or people, or anything else that can be identifying, especially in sensitive areas, and especially even if it's a sensitive area, even if you have permission. Don't show minors, don't add information on minors without consent. So there would be those kinds of things that one can put in, I think, for the databases themselves. But the papers, I don't think for that itself you will need that kind of the standard ethics that specifications that go to any journal. You must have some kind of a tick off. Have your has your research passed human subjects review? If not, why? Those kinds of things. When you're archiving data, that you have to have a larger challenge, because you don't want to archive, put out sensitive information. And so you will need some thought to this. It's not something obviously that can be done lightly, but there are some databases in different parts of the world, possibly not in India, that's all. And we could set up, if you had a committee to look at it in the Indian context across a range of disciplines, one should set that up. I think the challenge is really, why has that not been set up? Why is there something not? I might be missing something. So there might be something similar to archive.org in the humanities or social sciences, but I have not seen it either at the India scale or at the global scale. And it requires a lot of investment. It's not an easy thing to do, but somebody should really be doing it, is the question.
Actually, for social sciences, there is something called a SOC archive is available. The SSRN, Social Science Research Network, which was initiated.
SSRN, yes.
But now that is purchased by Elsevier. It's owned by Elsevier now. Its ideas are largely appropriated by the commercial publishers, but for-profit publishers in Western Europe and Northern America. So these kind of initiatives should be, as Latin Americans view it, open access should be scholars-led, government-funded, initiatives. That is what they put an emphasis on it. I think with this question, I think I'm taking 4 minutes away. The meeting is exceeding now. Professor Harini has engagements, other meetings and other things. So with that question, I would like to tell you that the access to information is very key as we see. So we have to maximize the use of literature produced out of public funds, particularly from universities, particularly from the ICSSR funded institutions, that they get funds consistently from states as well. Not many states fund for science and technology as much as for social sciences when we see here. It is beyond publishers, beyond the prestigious associated with a particular job.
Yes.
Published from university presses from the West or university presses from India, kind of, beyond all that, we have to maximize the use of such literature, availability of such literature in libraries, physical libraries, worldwide maximization of this research information to all possible would-be users. We are going to discuss.
I just want to share one thing. Azim Premji Foundation has already taken the lead in terms of funding the spread of open access to people, and EPW is the beneficiary of that. I must acknowledge the initiative.
Thank you so much. With that word, we would like to conclude this meeting here, and sincere thanks to the speaker, Professor Harini Nagendra and Professor Gopal Guru for your insightful discussions, and many thanks for the participants and for the local organizers and our knowledge partners from NIAS and DST Center for Policy Research. And we will be sending you more alerts about the forthcoming meetings under this banner of open access to humanities and social science information. The next one will be, we will be discussing about access and archives. So the next discussion is not about the knowledge that is kept under financial firewall or rights firewall. The archives that we have, that we develop out of our public funds should be accessible to all possible would-be users. We will be having 3 eminent speakers who will speak about access and archives and digital humanities possibilities in the next meeting. I'm looking forward to all your presence in the coming meetings as well. And our sincere thanks for your participation and time. Thanks again for Professor Gopal Guru and Professor Harini Nagendra.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and we enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, Professor Mitra. Bye.
Namaskar, Professor.
Namaskar.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I'm not able to take all the questions in the question and answer session. Still, we will be communicating all your questions to the speakers, and we will communicate the answers back to you.
Please do that.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Bye-bye.